Let me take just a minute and introduce myself. My name is Matt Boyer. I have the great pleasure to be the facilitator for this discussion today. I'm going to take just a couple of seconds to provide an overview. You're going to hear several things, several themes repeated throughout the day, but one of them that I'm going to start with, and you'll hear again and again, is what we're likely to see in transportation and in communities in the next 20 years is not like anything that we've seen in probably the last 75 years, at least not for any sustained period of time. And the question for all of us is, well, if it's a new normal, then what is that normal going to look like? And today what we're hoping to do is frame that discussion. So a little about me. My background, I started working for regional planning agencies 25 years ago this month down in the Central Valley, all rural and small suburban communities. Came up to the Gold Country, El Dorado County in 1995. Finished my career working for regional planning agencies and became essentially the public works director for the county, responsible for delivering transit services, roadway improvements, all of the Highway 50 improvements from Placerville down to Rancho Cordova. And I've essentially been in the special projects and consulting world ever since. The other thing that you may notice in some of the questions and provocative statements that I try to use today to draw people out is I'm also an elected official. I was elected to the El Dorado County Board of Education in 2003. And so over the last 11 years, I've had the pleasure of making policy decisions and grappling with policy issues on the items that I'm not the technical expert on. And so today we have a broad mix of people that represent those different perspectives. And so I wanted to take a minute and just so we all know roughly the cross-section of people in the room today, by show of hands or standing, who do we have from the Board of Supervisors here today? And how about from the City Council? Who do we have here that's from local agency staff, including the COG staff? So city staff, county staff, COG staff, so most of you. We also have, I know, some staff from outside the region. A couple of you raised your hand, but how many work for public agencies, but not directly in Calaveras County, just to get an idea? We have a number of folks here from the community. Do you want to raise your hand so we know? Thank you for coming today as well. And then I know a few of my colleagues in the consulting world are here too. If you're brave enough to raise your hands, let us know who you are. And some of you are county residents, so it's okay to wear multiple hats. So the objectives that we've set forward today are to build on the annual meeting that COG does every year to talk about what its statutory roles and responsibilities are. We want to talk about the current issues and trends that are facing COG as it goes into its deliberations next month about some of its roles and responsibilities in the next 3 to 5 years to try to address these emerging trends. The discussion today is intended to be highly thought-provoking and to move people out of sort of traditional comfort zones and consider things that perhaps we've dismissed in recent years for very good reasons. So nothing is intended to be political or partisan. It's intended to be thought-provoking. And if it comes across that way, it's only the inherent nature of the material, not the intent behind it. And so if you have questions throughout the day regarding that, those are the kind of things that we want to daylight, because it's been me with my background that's helped Melissa and the COG staff guide the program today, and we've tried very hard to have a very broad cross-section of people on the panels. As we said, the thesis is the next 20 years are unlike anything that we've seen in the last 75 years. So ask the tough questions. These sort of kind of go to your roles. Challenge the assumptions. Explore a paradigm shift. This is part of the new reality, is for us to be uncomfortable. And I can say, in my work, which extends throughout Northern California, this is the only agency that to this level is trying to get ahead of the curve and tackle these issues in a very innovative way. And I know in talking with the COG staff that they're not looking for a specific outcome. What they're looking for is a deep community understanding of the issues so that there's informed direction from her board in the months to come as to what is right for Calaveras County. And with that, I would welcome you today, invite Melissa to the podium, and ask you to be as participative as you feel comfortable with. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Melissa Eads, the Executive Director of the Calaveras Council of Governments, and welcome to our 2014 Policy Conference. I am grateful for your time, for your experience, and for sharing this day with us in Calaveras County. As you are aware, the nation and the state are preparing for a new generation of transportation policies and investments, and we're hearing that the next 20 to 30 years will be completely unlike the last. And with the interstate highway system defining the goals of the 20th century, our nation is working to define and discover transportation in the 21st century. It's these transitional times that leave us with more questions than answers. So it is my hope that this day and these discussions will serve to guide policy in our rural regions. I look forward to not only a dynamic discussion of the current challenges and trends, but also exploration of opportunities and partnership. Ultimately, I look forward to discussions that lead to a better understanding of our transportation future here in Calaveras County. Again, my thanks to each of you for your participation, and my thanks to our COG staff and the COG board for hosting, facilitating, and organizing today's events. Thank you, Matt Boyer, for helping us to facilitate as well. And at this time, I would like to introduce to you the chair of the Calaveras Council of Governments, Mr. Paul Stein. Paul has the distinct honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Mr. Will Kempton. Paul has served 2 terms as a District 2 supervisor from 1997 to 2004. He was appointed as Chief Deputy Director of the Department of Fish and Game by Governor Schwarzenegger. He was also instrumental in the formation of the COG Board in 1998. Paul is our longest-serving member of the Calaveras Council of Governments, so please join me in welcoming our board chair, Paul Stein.
Well, good morning. And it certainly is a privilege for me to introduce Mr. Kempton, the Executive Director of the Transportation of California. You know, I've looked up to Will for many, many years. I was just sharing some of our past background this morning, and he didn't realize that both of us are USF alumni. We're both Dons. We're both Jesuit trained, so look out. Will bring you some thought-provoking questions to mull over this morning. We were also very fortunate to be appointees to the Governor Schwarzenegger administration. Of course, he was the director of Caltrans. I was just the lowly Chief Deputy Director of Fish and Game. So it's great to have somebody with Will's background with us this morning. Mr. Kempton has 40 years of experience in transportation, public service, and government affairs, and is currently serving as Executive Director of the Transportation California, an industry-based transportation advocacy group. Mr. Kempton's career began at Caltrans, including stints as Chief of Office of Revenue Management, Assistant Director in charge of Legislative and Congressional Affairs, and finally was appointed in 2004 Director of Caltrans by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Before his tenure as Caltrans Director, Mr. Kempton served as the Director of the Santa Clara County Transportation Authority and partner in Smith, Kempton, and Watts, and as an Assistant Manager of the City of Folsom. Most recently, he served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Orange County Transportation Commission. Mr. Kempton will bring us the latest on transportation funding, financing, and related planning issues that impact regional and local governments. He has sage advice on all of these things that I'm sure that we're going to learn this morning. He offers lessons learned, new strategies for this current political climate, and what's trending on state and federal transportation funding issues. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Will Kempton.
Now, are you taping this, so I should use the microphone? Is that, Matt, you want to do that? But let's see if I can, I don't like to stay behind a podium because I can't see over most of them, so I'll just come out like this. This will work okay? Okay, well, it's great to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. I have quite a bit of experience with rural counties and worked, as a matter of fact, as a consultant for the COG in Amador that was actually a tri-party partnership, which I'm sure you're going to hear reference to today, Calaveras, Alpine, and Amador. And that partnership was extremely unique when it was first put together. And I know Paul was an original signatory on the deal. But combining three smaller rural counties and bringing their what we call STIP shares, their shares of the State Transportation Improvement Program, together in a single block so that they could focus on some larger projects, which normally rural counties have a very difficult time getting built, simply because they don't get enough money through the state, and obviously there's little local dollars to put into those major capital improvements. So it was really a coup to accomplish that. A lot of kudos went out to the three counties for working together, because every county got an important project out of that deal, and I benefited from one of them on my way here today, coming up from Folsom, riding on the Sutter Creek bypass, and what a great difference that makes in terms of getting up here to Murphy's. Normally when I come to Murphy's, it's not to speak at a policy group. I've been to this place many times, but again, not as a speaker. So we're going to talk a little bit today. I understand my charge is to give you sort of an overview of our infrastructure funding crisis as it relates to transportation. And we have huge infrastructure needs in California across the spectrum. So there's probably going to be some sort of a water bond on the November ballot. There are issues in education, issues in the judicial system, issues, unfortunately, in our correctional facilities, and issues in our schools, as well as transportation. So the infrastructure needs in a state that is continuing to grow and is beginning to age. Take our transportation system. It used to be pretty much brand new. So we didn't have the problems that states like New Jersey and Delaware and South Carolina that have been relying on their infrastructure for years and years and years. Moreover, the very bad weather that they experience in many of those states contributes to the destruction and deterioration of road and transportation facilities. We were pretty lucky. So those of us that were here, and I see a lot of folks that I would judge were here through the 60s and 70s, the growth of the transportation system in California was pretty striking. We were building new facilities. We were getting a lot of money from the federal government in support of the development of the interstate system, and things were pretty rosy from a transportation perspective. Well, the growing population, the continuing decline in tax revenues, the deficiencies that come with age on our system, and we're now pretty much in the same boat as most of those folks. So I'll give you that overview. We're going to start now. California's Transportation Commission just did a very comprehensive needs assessment. What's the situation in California for transportation needs over the next 10 years? They did this study back in 2011, and through 2021, we have about $500 billion worth of needs, and that's maintenance, and that's new construction, that's adding capacity, all of the things thrown into this pot, and it's multimodal. They've included all of the modes of transportation in this figure, including high-speed rail. So $500 billion worth of needs, and only about $200 billion, to pay for those needs over that 10-year period. And so that leaves a whopping gap of $295 billion of needs as judged by the Transportation Commission. Now, if you break that down over 10 years, that's $29.5 billion a year. And I always say a number like that goes over people's heads, because it does. It's difficult to get your arms around those kinds of needs and the need to have that kind of an expenditure, additional expenditure, by the way, for transportation. Next slide. So here are the current challenges as we see them. First of all, Proposition 1B is coming to an end. Most of you will remember Proposition 1B. It was the very large infrastructure package that Governor Schwarzenegger put before the voters in November of 2006. It was approved by the voters, and it provided $20 billion, $19.95 billion for transportation. About $13 billion of that went into capital work, and so a lot of improvements came out of that. That program has been well managed and well delivered. Well managed by the California Transportation Commission, which had extensive oversight responsibilities, and well delivered by Caltrans and the local agencies that were responsible for getting that work out. So here we are in 2014, and those capital dollars have all been spent. Not only have they been spent, but because of the recession that we've just experienced, the construction industry, I represent, were very hungry. They put good bids in on this project. We had lots of savings. We were able to take those savings and put them back into more projects. The dollars spent on this bond issue, the $13 billion in capital money, leveraged another two-thirds, total of $35 billion of project work in the state of California. So when people drive on the roads and say, well, these seem to be in pretty good shape, it's because of this recent investment. Coupled with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, a lot of money was put into paving over the roads. So if anybody's driven up Interstate 80 on the way to Reno, you know how bad that used to be? Well, $1 billion from these sources has been spent from the Bay Area to the Nevada state line in upgrading the roadway. It's fixing it first. It's not capacity expansion. It's taking care of what we have. Anybody that owns a house knows that you can't let the roof leak. You got to fix it. So we've got to take care of our existing system. There's been a decline of gas tax revenues and purchasing power, and this is pretty significant. Nobody likes high taxes. Nobody likes more taxes. The fact of the matter is, the last time the gas tax revenues, or the gas tax itself was raised, was in 1993 at the federal level, which is 18.4 cents a gallon, and 1994 at the state level, which is 18 cents a gallon. Now, you may have read about 2 years ago there was something called a gas tax swap. We used to pay sales tax on gasoline. We don't pay that anymore, and that was substituted with a similar amount of excise tax. I don't call that an increase. It was. We're paying more gas taxes, but it was revenue neutral. The sales tax went away and was no longer available for transportation, and they substituted an excise tax in place of that. So the taxpayer is paying the same amount at the pump that you would have paid under the old system in exchange for the new one. We're seeing a diversion of existing transportation revenues. That occurred primarily over the past 10 years when we had all of these budget crises at the state level. They would borrow. They would take money that they could take, but they would borrow money that was protected by the Constitution. Article 19 of the state Constitution protects gas tax revenues only for transportation. So any money that they borrowed, and they did borrow, has to be paid back. That's a discussion that we're having with the administration right now. And there's no state and federal solution. We don't see anything coming out of the state government for correcting the situation at this juncture. We'll talk a little more about that as well. And we don't see anything coming out at the federal level. Next slide. This is our most famous chart. This is called the fiscal cliff chart. So called because you see there's two lines, vertical lines, at the right side of the chart, one at the top and one near the bottom. We're, by the way, at the bottom now, but the cliff is where that blue blob falls down dramatically. And what this chart graphically shows is the levels of funding that are available for transportation. So starting with the bottom, the purple color, that's the State Highway Operations and Protection Program. That's what the state invests in taking care of the existing state highway system. Not all your local roads, by the way. That's Highway 4, Highway 49 in this area, 88. Those are the roads that get taken care of through the SHOP program. The other is the local funding provided through primarily transportation sales tax measures. Rural counties don't have the luxury of having those sales tax measures because they require a two-thirds vote. Generally a more conservative population in the rural counties. People are more concerned about tax issues and things of that nature. So we don't have many rural counties that have been able to pass these sales tax measures. But 19 counties in California, representing about 82% of the state's population, have these measures in place. They produce $3.5 billion a year for transportation. Then the red blob in the middle is the Prop 1B bond, and you can see that the main reason for the drop, or this cliff, is because we're through with those bond dollars. They provided a significant source of funding, probably another $3.5 billion a year while they were in place, for capital improvements on the state's transportation system. And then you have what we talk about in terms of the local money. And I, by the way, switched colors. The green represents the State Transportation Improvement Program. Apologize for that. That's the other state money that comes. And so you can see that those numbers are falling off too. The blue is the local money, which again is as big as it is primarily because of those local sales tax programs. Next slide. And this is the industry trend that we like to show people. How is this affecting a large segment of our economy, which is the heavy construction industry, in terms of the work that's available? In the second half of 2010, Caltrans every year does, or actually on an ongoing basis every quarter, does a look ahead. How much work are we going to be advertising over the next year? You want to let the construction industry know what's coming down the pike so they can begin to gear up for it. So in the second half of 2010, the number was $3.8 billion. By the second half of 2013, in 3 short years, that number had dropped to $1.3 billion. I'll do the math for you. That's a 60% reduction in the construction program going on in California. So from my members' perspective, that's the number that they're very interested in. And it's not getting any better. Next slide. And if you think the federal government is going to help, you got another thing coming. This shows, just in pictorial terms, across the top, you see the black where the end-of-year fund balances for the Highway Trust Fund have been from 1957 all the way through about 2013, as a matter of fact. And then you see the red begin to take over. The fact of the matter is, since 2008, the Federal General Fund has been supporting the Highway Trust Fund. This is where all of the transportation dollars, yes, including transit dollars, flow through. Very limited amount of transit dollars come directly out of the general fund, but most of this stuff comes through the Highway Trust Fund, and we are in bad shape. And just let me take a minute to tell you how serious this problem is. The Highway Trust Fund will be broke probably by July. There will be no money in this account. They will continue to collect gas tax revenues, and so the dollars will become trickling in, but the account will be belly up. And what this means for us and all other states is that we have to slow down. We get, in California, on average, about 30% of our money comes from the federal government. In a state like Arkansas, 85% of their money comes from the federal government. They've already stopped advertising projects. They can't afford to front the money to keep that project work going. The way the federal government works is you have to spend to get. So in California, we'll make a payment to a contractor on a federal aid job, and then we'll file a reimbursement claim with the Federal Highway Administration. They will, in a matter of a couple of days, electronically transfer that money back to the state highway account in California, and we're made whole. And that's how the system goes. When you have no money in the account, the Federal Highway Administration and others have to start meting out the dollars. We'll pay Arkansas this week. We'll pay California in 2 weeks when this next stream of revenues comes in. You can imagine the disruption that comes with that. That's going to happen in July unless the Congress addresses this situation with the Highway Trust Fund. So that's a very serious problem. No agreement in the Congress how to raise the money. President Obama has just released a $302 billion 4-year transportation program. That's great. It's wonderful. Nice level. Keep things going at essentially the same level, a slight bit of growth, but there's no money to pay for it. So that's the issue that we have to address there. Next slide. So I think we have several political obstacles. First of all, investing in transportation infrastructure is not a high priority. The public thinks that fixing it first, taking care of the existing system, is important. That ranks up there with education, ranks up there with, the economy. Everybody thinks we need to take care of the existing system. However, you get to the political level, we're all focused on water. Not to say that we shouldn't be focused on water. I'm not saying that at all. That's a very important issue. We're focused on education, also another important issue. We're focused on different things. There just doesn't seem to be the focus that's necessary on transportation. And voters believe they're paying enough taxes. I certainly know I do. So we have that issue to address, or at least get people to recognize that there is a significant need, and they're going to get a return on their investment if they pay more. And that's the most important obstacle on this slide, and that is that skepticism is at an extremely high level about government doing the right thing with our tax dollars. People think we're wasting money. If you look at what folks say, and we've done extensive voter research over the last year, people are saying the money's being diverted, you're not spending it well, you're not taking care of the business. That is a huge issue in terms of a political obstacle. And finally, there are a few political champions. Many of you may remember State Senator Randy Collier. He was called the silver fox of the Siskiyous because he had a silver mane of hair, and he was the father of the freeway system in California. People like Jim Mills from San Diego, who started the state's investment in rail and transit. People like John Ferran from San Francisco, who saw the benefit of transportation and continually worked to not only improve the process, but to get more money for the program. We don't have very many of those kinds of people in Sacramento, nor for that matter, in Washington. So when you look at these issues and you try to get people engaged at the political level, it's quite a bit more difficult. And this is where I think some of the local officials and certainly members of the public can be helpful in this process, is by engaging our elected officials in Sacramento and Washington and telling them how important these issues are. Next slide. So what do? The need is substantial. The system continues to deteriorate. The industry is definitely suffering. We have formed a coalition to identify solutions. We've got Transportation California, my organization. We've got the California Alliance for Jobs, which represents the Northern California industry and construction labor. We've got the California State Association of Counties, the League of California Cities, and the California Transit Association, all working together. By the way, we will tomorrow be in the Department of Finance offices talking with the Director of Finance, asking him to please understand our problem and figure out a way to help us gain some more resources for the program. Next slide. The options that we've considered over the past year as we've looked at ways to raise more money for transportation: gas tax increase. Not a popular increase, as I'll show you in a few moments. We've looked at a new statewide bond measure similar to Proposition 1B because that was so successful. How about cap and trade? Not asking you to support that particular source of funding, but it is money, and 38% of greenhouse gas emissions come from mobile sources. So don't you think that 38% of the dollars that are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions ought to go to transportation? Sounds good to me. Lowering voter threshold on local measures so that it would be easier for counties at the rural area and for other counties to re-up those programs. 55% is the number that has been suggested. An increase in the vehicle license or the vehicle registration fee. We'll talk about those in just a moment. And the possibility of a diesel excise tax increase. Next slide. So why did my organization, along with the Alliance for Jobs, choose to pursue a vehicle license fee increase in 2014? We are not going to do that, and I'll take you through the history of it. But back in fall of last year, as we looked for ways to raise more money for transportation, we thought that a vehicle license fee might do the trick. We might be able to put in place a program that would raise $3 billion for transportation. We thought that the VLF was a fair and equitable concept. Early polling showed that there was some interest on the part of the public to do that, and then there was very little support for some of the other options. Next slide. Just to run through these real quickly. Gas tax option. People thought, no way. Increasing the state gas tax by 10 cents per gallon, only 11% support. Now the real significant number here is the 86% opposition. Those of you that have followed polls or seen them in the newspaper know that you usually have a support group, you have an opposition group, and then you have an undecided group. And the undecided group can sometimes be larger than the support and opposition group. So you have a pool of folks that you can try to convince to come over to your side on a particular issue. 86% opposition is a lot of opposition. No gas tax increase. Next slide. Declining support for lower voter threshold. In November of 2012, 45% of folks that we surveyed said, yeah, we would consider that. In November of 2013, a year later, that had dropped to 35%. I don't think we're going to see this measure before the voters anytime soon either. Next slide. Bonds. People are finally beginning to understand bonds are not free. They cost money, and they are very costly, about, in round numbers, about double what you get. So if you get a $20 billion bond issue, you're going to have to pay about $40 billion over the 30 years of that particular bond. So we asked varying levels, the $20 billion bond for a repeat of Proposition 1B, only 24% support. There is a little light at the end of the tunnel with respect to a small bond, $5 billion garnered 54% support. Next slide. VRF, the vehicle registration fee, we looked at that. To raise a reasonable amount of money, $3 billion or so, we'd have to increase the vehicle registration fee by about $95 per year. Again, look at that support and opposition. That's not going to work either. Next slide. The VLF increase, we did 2 separate surveys over the last summer. Initially got a 49% support, provided we had conditions that dedicated the money, that aimed it at fix it first, couldn't be diverted, voter approval before the funds would extend beyond a certain time frame, annual audits, taking care of the money, 49%. In August, we wrote ballot language, which would be the language you'd see in the ballot pamphlet, and that got 57% support. So we thought, wow, this may be an opportunity for us to raise some more money for transportation. Next slide. So the transportation user fee, as we were calling it, it was called the California Road Repairs Act, would have increased the vehicle license fee. That's the in lieu property tax, the car tax, as it's called. It would have been progressive. It had a built-in inflation factor because the price of vehicles does go up continually. We would dedicate the funding and we would provide a portion of the money for transit. Next slide. Constitutional amendment was necessary, so it required a statewide ballot measure. Obviously, it could be put on the ballot by the legislature. We didn't expect that, so we knew we were going to have to pay to qualify it through petitions. And we needed good numbers before the trigger would be pulled on an expensive campaign. Next slide. The draft measure was filed with the Attorney General in November to obtain title and summary. That is the bold language you see when you open up your ballot pamphlet. A lot of people read only that. They don't go any further, so it's very important language to describe what an initiative does. It would have been over 4 years. It would have been 1/4% increase over those each year for 4 years, for a total of an increase in 1% of each vehicle's value, about $120 for the average driver a year. Phased in over 4 years. Trucks didn't like the notion of that, so we were going to substitute their contribution through a diesel excise tax increase, which they agreed to. An annual total revenue estimated at $3 billion a year. Next slide. The new revenue allocation was 25% to California cities, 25% to California counties, 40% to the state highway account for shop purposes, for fix it first, and 10% to transit to replace aging transit and rail facilities. The reason the number was lower for transit is because there are other, the cap and trade is one good example. They will do a better job of qualifying for those revenues, so we kept a smaller amount here. And also the public, general public is more supportive of improvements to streets and roads. And then fixing it first, maintenance and rehabilitation, replacement of equipment, repairing potholes, etc. Next slide. So title and summary and fiscal impact came back on January. We immediately took their language, which was okay, the language prepared by the Attorney General, and we tested it with the voters. Based on those results, 39% support, you can imagine why we put the measure on hold. Next slide. Okay, so the pros, in terms of voter sentiments, we need to keep up with road maintenance. They understand it's going to cost much more later. We know that any new revenue should be used only for repairs, not diverted. But what the negatives are, they think there's plenty of money for road repair if we just spend it more wisely. We can't trust government to spend our tax dollar money effectively, even for road maintenance. And now that the recession is going away and we're recovering, it's not a time to raise taxes. Next slide. So factors leading to our decision: marginal support, voters still feeling the effects of the prolonged economic downturn. They want assurances that dollars are well spent before they dig into their pockets for more money. Dedicated financing and a viable campaign in the current political and economic environment cause great concerns, because we were going to have to rely on an industry that is suffering to lead the charge to raise more money for transportation. So our challenge at this point is we're embarking on the heaviest political lift that I've ever seen in 40 years of being in the business. We're going to have to work very hard to gain a solution. And I don't think there's any silver bullet. We're probably going to be looking at a combination of things to help take care of our transportation system. Next slide. The best opportunities remaining, we think, are recapturing truck weight fees, Advancing loan repayments, remember those loans we talked about earlier where they borrowed from state transportation accounts to shore up the general fund. We think increase in cap and trade funds for the portion of those funds that are eligible for mobile source improvements. We think we need to implement a vehicle miles traveled pilot. That appears to be the trend in this country, moving away from the gas tax because the gas tax is not a sustainable funding source. Declining revenues, loss of purchasing power, etc., a more fuel-efficient fleet. So a vehicle miles traveled pilot is something we want to test in California. They're already testing it in Washington and Oregon and in other states across the country. We ought to look to see how that might work in California. We think that potentially a $5 billion bond program for transportation is out there. And then this is critical, reform measures, more accountability, more transparency, making the program work better so people get a much better feeling for keeping their tax dollars. Recapturing the truck weight fees, I'm going to move along here because I'm over my time. This would recapture about $1 billion for transportation. We want to redirect the fees back to our program, at least until the expiration of Governor Brown's Prop 30 tax increases. This would raise potentially $4 or $5 billion over the course of that period. The numbers from the public are very strong. Actually, it says 70%, over 70% support. 79% of the public would vote to redirect those funds back to transportation. So we have a bit of a leverage in dealing with our friends at the Department of Finance and in the administration. Advanced loan payments, the governor, to his credit, included $351 million in this year's budget. Proposal for repayment of $351 million. We think there's another $1.5 to $2.5 billion out there. We'd like to get those scheduled over the next several years so that we have a revenue stream coming in. Clearly, there are general fund implications of taking those monies early. Next slide. Cap and trade. Won't go into that in any detail because we've talked about it. There's $850 million in this year's budget proposal from the governor for cap and trade funding. The majority of the money is going to high-speed rail and rail modernization. Next slide. So distribution of cap and trade has also been proposed by Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg. We kind of like this program a little bit better because there's a dedicated source of funding for transit. 30% of the money would go to transit. We think that sort of allows us to check the box on transit, at least over the interim time frame. So we think this is potentially a better proposal. Still provides something on the order of 10% for highway and road rehabilitation and complete streets. Next slide. The annual appropriation, these are some of the numbers. These are off the top programs that Steinberg's proposal would fund. Next slide. And the VMT pilot, as I said, VMT may be the long-term solution. We're actually calling it a road user charge or a mileage-based user fee. That may be the long-term solution, so we're working on that. In fact, we just presented to the Senate Transportation and Housing Committee yesterday our bill to accomplish that, SB 1077. It passed out of the committee pretty handily, so if this is going to be the future direction, let's get started now and get that revenue stream in place. And by the way, that would be in place of the gas tax. We're not talking about on top of the gas tax. Bond program, short-term or interim fix, again, 54% support a smaller bond. We will probably have to identify a source of debt service. Maybe that's a small increase in the vehicle registration fee or something along those lines. That's probably not something that we'll be able to present until 2016. Next slide. And then the reform. These are the things that we're working on. You can take your time to go through those, and I'm happy to answer any questions on them. But the bottom line is we've got to make it, we've got to make how we do business better. And that's really an important element of what we're talking about. Next slide. So our strategy going forward is to inform and educate the public. That's one of the reasons why I was happy to come up here. We're obviously going to have to work with the governor. Whether you like the governor's policies or not, he's probably a pretty good bet to win re-election. We need to cultivate our transportation advocates in the legislature, rebuild a transportation caucus, develop those political champions, and we need to, of course, build our coalition and to tell our story. That's one thing that those of us in the public works and transportation business don't do a good job of, and that is talking to people about the good things that we do. All we see is what's in the paper about the Bay Bridge. I will just say, as a shout out to Caltrans, and as somebody who was intimately involved in the start of that project, if I wanted to be anywhere in the Bay Area during an earthquake, it would be sitting on that bridge, because that's one of the safest facilities that have ever been constructed. So let Charles Pillar and the Sacramento Bee do all of their criticisms. That is a great project and engineering marvel. That's enough for that. But in any event, we do need to tell our story and talk about the positive things we do. Okay? And then I like to close all these presentations with the fact that it is up to us. Any of us that are interested in transportation in this room, we need to be talking to our neighbors, our friends, and telling them about the problems in transportation. It's been my pleasure to present to you today, and I think I'm maybe a couple of minutes over the time frame here, but this is an important message. Do we have any time for questions?
We do, and what I was going to say is some of the deepest questions we can ask are probably after Sharon and Mike and a few of the other speakers speak today, but I know Will's on a schedule, so I want to give him an opportunity to answer questions directly. And maybe I'm going to start with the first one, and that is, can you just give us the quick thumbnail of your organization and the fact that the contracting community that you work with and represent is not advocating directly for roads or transit, or how all of that plays into what you presented?
Okay, Transportation California is an industry-based advocacy group, as Paul indicated. My members are construction contractors, construction labor, material suppliers, other people involved in the construction industry, but we have other folks, other stakeholders that are engaged as well. We have 74 members. We have been involved in every single major transportation initiative across the state over the past 25 years. And so we've been protecting transportation dollars, we've been raising transportation dollars, and we have a pretty good track record of success. As I said earlier, this is the most difficult challenge I've seen in the 40 years I've been in the business, and the current environment is very difficult, and we're going to have a big hurdle to clear to get some more resources directed at our program.
Thank you. So you all get 2 continuing education units for this because Will can compact an entire course into a 30-minute presentation. Open it up for questions. Questions, easy questions or hard? Gary.
Well, that's exactly the opposite of what was done in 2010 and 2011. The gas tax swap we did have a sales tax on gasoline in conjunction with the excise tax. Both of them were in place. A lot of people used to say we're being double taxed because they'd pay a gasoline and excise tax per gallon, and then they'd pay the sales tax. In both cases, I would say they still are based on the sale of gasoline. Whether you don't want to be constantly going back and increasing that sales tax rate beyond what you're paying for other commodities. And the gas usage is what is going down because there are more fuel-efficient vehicles, and there's an equity issue here as well. You've got a lot of people driving electric vehicles and low-emission vehicles that are paying very little or nothing to use the roads. So there ought to be a fee that covers road usage, that is equitable for everyone, so that if you're going to use the highways and local streets and roads, you're going to be paying for that use and for that benefit. Well, there's a lot of other issues that have been considered. I think some of those taxes are a little beyond our electorate's ability to absorb and to. And I don't mean to say that they can't understand it. They can understand it very well, but they are not there yet when it comes to saying that's a reasonable method to raise money.
Thanks, Matt. Mr. Kempton, I don't think you can highlight enough the skepticism that people feel about government efficiency and how we're spending tax dollars. Can you please discuss a little bit the reforms that are being discussed to make it more transparent?
Well, let's start with the transparent, and you're absolutely right. I hope I emphasized it in my presentation. It is absolutely critical that we gain the public's confidence, and we have not done a good job of doing that, either by not talking about the positive things that are done through Public Works, but also the fact that we keep having issues like the perceptions about the Bay Bridge, other things that are going wrong, these computer programs that are crashing. There's not a lot of confidence in government right now, and certainly not in transportation. So I think that transparency is the first issue. We went to Washington last summer. We took the folks from the Transportation Agency in Sacramento with us to see how Washington does it. They do something called the Gray Notebook. They produce this notebook I think it's on a quarterly basis, and they write it in a way that's called, they call it performance journalism, where they talk about how people's dollars are being spent. And it's a very comprehensive publication that explains how the dollars are being expended, but it does it in a way that people can understand and relate to it. There's a story about, a mom driving kids to school or something along those lines. It's a really good way to get the word out. After they started publishing that in the early 2000s, within 3 years, the legislature approved a gas tax in that state because there was a growing sense of confidence in what the State Department of Transportation was doing in Washington. So we came back. We were going to introduce legislation to require Caltrans to do that. The administration said, you don't have to tell us to do it, we'll do it. They produced something called the mile marker. First edition came out just a month or so ago. And they're trying to mimic or imitate what Washington did in terms of getting that word out. There are a whole host of other kinds of technical things that we have allowing for alternative bid procedures, for more efficient procurement methods. We have legislation in for that. We want to attract more private investment, do it in a more efficient way. So there's a whole host of things that we are pressing forward on. And then we're participating in an effort sponsored by the Secretary of the Transportation Agency called the California Transportation Infrastructure Priorities Effort, which is looking at a lot of reform measures for how we can make the transportation program more efficient and help us to demonstrate to the public that we're good stewards of the tax dollars. And that's a big hurdle, a huge challenge.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I think we had a couple other questions over here. Chris, and we're going to extend into the break just a little bit.
You mentioned that in August 2013, the VLF polled at 57%, and it went to the Attorney General's office. And when it came back, you mentioned that the polling was not favorable. What did Ms. Harris do to the language?
Well, one thing that she and her folks did was they didn't mention repairs. It was the California Road Repairs Act, and repair was critical. They said in their analysis or in their language that it was money for highway projects. We don't know that made the difference, but it certainly didn't help. It's hard. You can't tell the Attorney General how to write these initiatives. We think if our language had been used, it would have been better. I'm not sure it would have been over 50%, but that's one of the reasons.
I think we have one question here, and then I'll wrap up with the final one for you.
Here you go, Jim.
Yeah, I'm standing in the way of your break, and that's not a good place to be.
Just quickly, under the VMT pilot programs, how are the revenues distributed, and how do you differentiate between miles on state roads and local roads? And you can get money for it, but how does that money work its way back to local cities and counties?
Right. Very good question. And the simple answer is that all of that's going to have to be determined via this pilot program. Caltrans has a study underway right now to start examining all of these issues, and we'll figure out how they're going to implement the pilot program. Pilot program probably won't be implemented until the 2017-2018 fiscal year, so it's a ways off in terms of working on answering all of those questions. And there are a number of questions. Rural folks tend to drive greater distances. Are we going to be penalizing rural residents because of the mileage tax? Well, you're paying more on the gas tax by virtue of the greater distances as well, so there's some corollary there. The money, and this is really critical, what rate we set that mileage fee at is going to govern how effective a solution it will be to the transportation problems. And that rate is obviously to be determined, but it has to take care of city streets, county roads, state highways, and there's got to be something in there for conventional rail and transit. If we're going to really look at a comprehensive transportation system in the state that serves both urban and rural needs, then that is a very key question as to how we implement a vehicle miles travel tax in California.
So maybe one last question from me, Will. So we're all conditioned before red state, blue state became popular way of looking at the world. We've all been conditioned to know that our policy ebbs and flows back and forth. I'm particularly struck by some of your slides and my own research that says think tanks of any flavor don't have great evolutionary or revolutionary solutions. And I'm wondering what that means for rural counties. And is this a red state, blue state issue where we're 2 elections away from getting back to where we were, or is there something else going on?
Well, I think to some degree it is a red state, blue state issue because we are becoming more polarized geographically, it seems to me, this is just my observation, between our rural and agricultural counties and our tend to be populated coastal counties. The LAs, the San Diegos, the San Francisco Bay areas. And so that portion of it, I wouldn't say necessarily is political in nature, it's geographical in nature. And that's something that we have to be very concerned about. Everybody has to be taken care of. That's what I just said in answering this gentleman's question. I think if we're going to go to a VMT, it's got to be structured in such a way that it addresses all of the transportation needs around California.
Well, we really appreciate your time. We've ebbed into the break just a little bit. Round of applause for Will Kempton.
Thank you.